support a discussion of this issue today at today's conference. I want to thank and congratulate our students at Catholic University's Journal of Common Law Conspectus and the Institute of Communications Law Studies, and our faculty directors and advisors, Professor David Irwin and Professor Donna Coleman-Gregg, for all of their support, and also our good friends at the Federal Communications Bar Association, who are always with us and help us in our work in this very important area of practice. And on behalf of the entire community at Catholic, I'd like to thank the firm of Wiley and Ryan for allowing us to host and have this wonderful event at this beautiful location. It's very convenient, and I'm so happy that you all are able to join us. And thanks in advance to all of our speakers today. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Dean Miles. Our keynote speaker needs no introduction to this audience. We are very pleased that he took time out of his busy schedule to join us today. Please join me in welcoming Eddie Lazarus, Chief of Staff to FCC Chairman Julius Janikowski.
Good morning. Thank you, Kevin. I see it, it's a little bit like when I used to teach law. Nobody likes to sit in the first few rows. But it's great to be here. Kevin, you rest assured that the FCC is doing everything it can to provide full employment for communications lawyers. And I think we're doing whatever else we may be failing at, we're definitely succeeding at that. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I thank Catholic University for inviting me. It's an auspicious time to come speak, because, as you all know, we are about to deliver our national broadband plan to Congress. And I thought I'd just try and give a bit of an overview of that plan today. I'd like to start with a comment about the FCC process that has produced the plan. For the last 8 months, a team of engineers and economists and technologists, business executives, policy analysts, and yes, even a few lawyers have been incredibly hard at work at the FCC on the first strategic plan that the country has ever done on broadband. They run the most open process, I think, in the history of the Commission. I don't even know how many open workshops they did at this point, but over 50, I think. And frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, they have been almost literally killing themselves to get this project done. And I can tell you at this point, because we do have the full draft of the Commission now, they have done an extraordinary job in producing a meaningful strategic plan for the country. And the agency is in their debt, and frankly, I believe the nation will be in their debt. Well, some have asked, why we've gone to this extraordinary effort. And I think that history gives at least some answers. We know from history that the nations that lead in technological revolutions reap huge economic and social benefits. This is especially true when you're talking about a revolution that involves what are often called general purpose technologies. Those are technologies which are really a means to a great many ends, and it can empower a wide array of human endeavors. So think of the steam engine or electricity. In the 19th century, they ushered in the Industrial Revolution, which completely changed manufacturing, everything about how the Western world did business, and much of everyday life. Now the internet is the latest general purpose technology, and it is flattening the world and creating a revolution in communications and information technology. We're only just beginning to appreciate what broadband will mean for the world and what it can mean for Americans specifically. The communications and information sector of the economy already boasts many of America's most dynamic companies. Cisco, Intel, Google, Amazon, Apple, eBay, Microsoft, Qualcomm, IBM, NVIDIA, Adobe. You could just go on and on. They lead the world in product and chip design, application design, business innovation. AT&T, Verizon, and their cable counterparts are investing billions of dollars in upgrading their networks and achieving real breakthroughs in 4G and DOCSIS 3.0. The information and communications sector of the American economy represents roughly $8 trillion in revenue, 10 million jobs, and 13% of GDP. Scholars at institutions as diverse as the World Bank and MIT and Brookings all tell us that increasing the spread of broadband by even a small amount can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. In short, the potential of what broadband can deliver to us in terms of economic growth and improvement of quality of life, from healthcare to education to energy and the free exchange of ideas is nearly boundless. But the challenge for the United States is whether it will capture the jobs and economic growth and innovation that broadband will yield, or instead, whether the lion's share of those benefits will migrate to our global competitors. The United States invented the internet, but when it comes to broadband, we are falling behind. Whether you believe the surveys that rank us 15th or 16th in the world, or whether you believe the surveys that rank us somewhat higher than that, all of the surveys show that we are not yet close. We are not close to leading the world, and not nearly as close as we ought to be. That might be okay for a few years or a tad longer, but over time, lagging in broadband will exact a terrible price in lost opportunity. The next great chipset, they'll be designed in China or South Korea or Japan or Sweden or somewhere else. Same for other important innovations. Simply put, if current trends are not reversed, we will lose good jobs, vital businesses, and the technological edge that has been such a great source of American prosperity to our global competitors. Let me get more concrete. Here are some of the gaps we must confront. More than 10 million Americans, mostly in rural America, have no broadband access whatsoever. That's not an abstract problem. With broadband, every one of those 10 million or more could start a business and reach a worldwide market. With broadband, every one of those 10 million or more could have access to the kind of remote medical care that might save lives. Broadband brings hope and opportunity, and right now, millions of us simply don't have access to it. More than 90 million Americans do not have broadband at home, even if they could, mostly because they can't afford it, don't know how to use it, or don't understand its remarkable potential. That's not an abstract problem either. With broadband, you can file the online job applications that are now the only method of submitting applications to the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies. With broadband, a whole world of information is at your fingertips, whether you're a kid doing a research paper or a senior looking for healthcare information. But if you're not online, it's not there. And let me give you one more sobering statistic. Here Kevin quoted from Andy Grove, one Intel chair. I'll quote from a different one, the current one, Paul Ottolini. He was talking yesterday, and he cited this statistic. According to one recent study, the U.S. ranks 6th among the top 40 nations in the world in terms of current technological competitiveness. Not first, but pretty decent. The same study also found that the U.S. ranks 40th out of 40, the dead bottom, in terms of rate of change and innovation. It's not really hard to see where we're headed directionally if we don't wake up and start doing something to develop the best communications networks in the world, to spur innovation and investment in our technological infrastructure, and connect the entire nation to the possibilities of the 21st century. So what do we need to do? Well, to begin with, we need to set for ourselves some ambitious but realistic goals. And I would further suggest that those goals need to be tied to American ideas. And I'll throw out 2 as kind of organizing principles to think about. The first is equal opportunity, and the second is unlimited horizons. Let me start with the unlimited horizons. We need to upgrade our networks so that the next generation of incredible apps, inventions in education and healthcare and clean tech so amazing that they really seem to defy space and time are created right here at home. The same goes for the next generation of chips and the next generation of smart devices like the iPad and the Kindle. This means having broadband networks that will empower American innovators and attract the best and brightest from all over the world. And I see at least three pieces to this. First, we must create the world's largest market of very high-speed broadband users, what the chairman has now dubbed his 100 Squared initiative. That is, at least 100 million people with access to affordable broadband at least 100 megabits per second, to enable American ingenuity and ensure that businesses, large and small, are created here and staying. The result will be to provide Americans with the dramatic improvements in healthcare, education, energy conservation, job training, and public safety that high-speed internet will bring. Second, we need ultra-high-speed internet broadband test beds, as fast or faster than any other internet in the world, to make sure that America has the infrastructure to host the boldest experiments that the human mind can imagine. Google has already announced one such test bed. There are news reports that Cisco is joining the party. And we need more and ever broader initiatives to drive innovation and competition to invent the future here. Third, we need to lead the world in mobile communications. As our everyday experience with smartphones and e-readers and hundreds of thousands of applications tell us every day, broadband is the future of mobile, and mobile is the future of broadband. We need the infrastructure to capture that future here. And later today, Chairman Janikowski will be discussing more about this across town, and so you can read about it in tomorrow's papers. But fast is not nearly enough. We also need to provide universal opportunity to join the broadband revolution. That's the equal opportunity component. In the very near future, broadband will be a nearly indispensable part of American life, and we must translate theoretical accessibility into actual broadband adoption. The digital divide has become an opportunity divide, and we must bridge it, which means we cannot settle for anything less than the goal that every American, regardless of geography, regardless of income, regardless of the degree of digital proficiency, should have access to sufficiently robust broadband to allow them to enjoy the fundamental benefits of this technology. Of course, goals are just the start of the plan. You still need to figure out how to achieve those goals. And when you're sitting in a federal agency, as I do, you need to assess what role government should play in all of this. Now, to know the answers, you're just going to have to wait and read the hundreds and hundreds of pages of the broadband plan. But I would like to emphasize one important point this morning. Government will have a variety of roles to play, but its foremost role must be to enable, to empower, and to accelerate the investment and innovation of private parties, and to use the resources within its exclusive purview wisely and well. So what does that mean more specifically? Well, it means spectrum, of course. That is a government-controlled resource, and it has to be allocated efficiently and allocated to the uses of the future, and allocated and used with greater efficiency. And that's something the chairman is going to talk about significantly more this afternoon. It means redirecting government spending. Every year the government spends roughly $8 billion as part of the Universal Service Fund. That was a fund that very successfully supported the universalization of the telephone. But to a significant degree, not entirely, but to a significant degree, that is a fund that remains oriented towards the technology of the 20th century and not the technology of the 21st century. And that has to change. Then there's some real blocking and tackling stuff that government has control over. Rights of way, conduits, pole attachments, the kind of thing that communications lawyers live for. But the use of those government resources has to be made simpler and easier and at lower cost to help spur private building. Then there's the issue of standardization and interoperability, where government could also play an important role. Yesterday I heard someone talking about the fact that if we don't have networks, it's like building the best electric car in the world but having no roads. Well, if you don't have standardization and interoperability, It's like building a series of highways that actually don't connect to each other with exit ramps and entrance ramps. And that's the situation we have in healthcare, IT, and other places. To make all of that work for the United States, to get the savings it will bring, the increased, the benefits it will bring, we have to have standardization and interoperability, and that is also, in significant ways, a government function. We need to have increased competition through greater transparency, so that the consumer market, consumer knowledge, can be used to drive innovation and drive down prices. And in this last category, not a small one at all, the government itself must move in the way the private sector already has done, from the analog world to the digital world. The purchasing power of the government, the way government itself can change the habits of use. All of this has to be revolutionized and reinvented, and the government must move to the digital world. And the Broadband Plan will discuss all of these points and many others in great detail with specific recommendations for how to use those levers to push forward with improved broadband technology. So we can do these and other things to seize the future. Over the next year, the FCC is going to undertake literally dozens of rulemakings pursuant to the plan. And we're going to need the help and the guidance and the support of the people in this room. But this really is a circumstance where failure is not an option. And so we will simply have to succeed. And with your help and support, I'm confident we will. Thank you. I'm happy to take a few questions. Can't promise that I'll answer.
Eddie, will the plan make specific recommendations on some of the issues that have been around for a while, like the D block, universal service? Will the plan say specifically what either the Commission ought to do or Congress ought to do, or will that mean further rulemakings? And how much guidance for those rulemakings will the plan provide?
So the broadband plan will contain specific recommendations in all of the areas that you would expect, including USF and things like that. I think the way I think about the plan, because it's a strategic plan, it's not self-effectuating. The plan is not something where it comes out and that's the rule. It will have to be followed by rulemakings. But the idea would be you set a goal, you show a path, and you recommend the first steps along the path that the Commission needs to take. Now, this is a plan that actually projects out a fair distance. So what you also need to do is establish benchmarking, reassessment times, so that you make sure that the first 3 or 4 steps you suggest along a particular path are in fact the smart steps to take when you look back in 2 or 3 years. You do course correction if necessary, et cetera, et cetera. It's got to be a living, breathing document. But yes, it will have many, many specific recommendations, not only with respect to the FCC, but with respect to some legislative asks, and with respect to things that need to be done within the executive branch to make sure that we leverage connectivity for all of the national purposes described in the Recovery Act as part of the plan, from healthcare to education to energy to public safety, etc. So it will be specific, but it won't be either self-effectuating or trying to drive all the way to the end goal, because predicting the future is just too difficult. So we need to start down a path and then keep moving. Yes, sir.
David Irwin from the Columbia School of Law Institute for Communications Law Studies. I wanted to ask you, in the context of your remarks about the Universal Service Fund, how hard, how political, how difficult will it be to change the focus of the funding from the preservation of today's wireline voice service known as POTS, plain old telephone service, to the service of the future, which would fit in the chairman's 100 squared and beyond definition.
Well, if performing universal service were easy, it would have been done already. This is an issue that, as everyone who is in this area knows, has been hanging around and hanging around and hanging around. We can't afford to have that happen anymore. It's going to be hard. It's a very, very complicated program. As you know, there's several elements to it. It's not just the high cost fund. You've got Lifeline Link-Up, and you've got the Rural Health and E-rate. There are going to be specific recommendations with respect to all of that, and we have to push forward. Difficulty really isn't the issue here. It's necessity. Sir?
Peter Tanwall, is there any place in the United States where it might be too expensive to provide 100 megabit broadband?
To provide 100 megabit broadband.
You said that
There
was
may
the
be,
goal.
yeah. No, I said that the goal is affordable 100 megabit broadband to 100 million Americans. And that everyone needs to have robust broadband that would allow them to enjoy the fundamental benefits that broadband can bring.
Regardless of the cost, every square inch of the country.
Robust, not 100 megabits. Right. The thing about speed is that you can't know at this moment what the market is actually going to be. What is the speed that that the applications of tomorrow are going to require? They may very well require 100 megabits. They may not. We don't want to be in a position, this is one of those ones where we're going to have to readjust goals and reassess along the way as we see how the applications market develops. But everybody in America needs to be able to get connected to the stuff of healthcare, energy, education, all of those fundamental applications have to be available everywhere.
If somebody chooses to live in the middle of the desert in New Mexico and it costs $100,000 to reach it, we need to spend that.
We believe that all Americans can be, you'll see what the funding schemes are when the plan comes out. We do not believe, we believe there are ways to get robust broadband to all Americans that don't break the bank. The plan will not have a $350 billion price tag attached to it as the numbers that you've occasionally seen in the press. Yes?
Good morning, Stephanie Joyce. Thank you for your comments. My question is with regard to universal service. Will the plan set forth any specific policy recommendations for the kind of mechanisms within the universal service fund that could be used for broadband funding?
I actually am going to defer that till the plan comes out because I get into a position here where I'm going to try really hard today not to make any news. But universal service is one of the hardest nuts to crack. It just is because there are companies that are very dependent upon that support. We need to figure out the appropriate glide path to transit. There are no flash cuts here. We want to figure out the right way to change, to shift the course of the battleship without anybody falling overboard to the extent we can. And that's a very complicated, and I'm going to let the plan speak for itself on it.
Maybe one other.
Sure.
Regarding universal service, is that representative of the kind of thing that whatever you recommend in the plan, you have to coordinate somehow with the fact that legislation is out there and perhaps will be moving.
Of course.
Voucher bill or whatever.
Yes.
What are you doing to plow that ground ahead of time for whoever's going to do what?
We've tried to coordinate very closely with our counterparts around government. This is the one thing you can always that can always trip you up, I think, in an agency is when you're just operating under your own bubble and you're not thinking about what other branches of government are thinking about, what other players in the ecosphere are considering. So obviously we're paying close attention, talking to the Hill on these issues, briefing them on what we're thinking, getting briefings on what they're thinking. There are going to have to be rulemakings on USF. It's not something where the plan is going to come out and everybody goes, oh, the magic solution. There are going to be a series of NPRMs on USF when it comes out. What we need to do is provide impetus and directionality for USF, meaningful USF reform, and that's what we're trying to do with the plan. Well, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Eddie, for those excellent and informative remarks and for taking so many questions. I'm excited about our first panel discussion today, what should and what will be in the National Broadband Plan. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Robert Atkinson, and panel members include Kathy Brown from Verizon Communications, Joel Kelsey from the Consumers Union, Russ Lieberman from the American Cable Association, David Rettel from CTIA, and Rick Witt from Google. Robert, the floor is yours.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. This is an opportunity to discuss the broadband plan, and we're joined this morning by five excellent panelists. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a policy think tank here in D.C. And I'm not really going to do introductions for folks, but I'll just go down the line. Kathy Brown is Senior Vice President for Public Policy Development and Corporate Responsibility at Verizon. Rick Witt is the Washington Telecom and Media Council at Google. Joel Kelsey is the Policy Analyst at Consumers Union. David Rettel is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA. And Ross Lieberman is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at the American Cable Association. And I know the title says what should be in the plan and what will be in the plan. According to my calculations, I think we have, 20 days, something like that, for the plan. So I think we can wait 20 days, okay? Let's wait 20 days to figure out what's in the plan. So I'd rather not just get into this kind of speculation, what's going to be in the plan and what's not going to be in the plan. I'd rather get into the notion of what should be in the plan and what might the effects of that be. You know, it's even possible that I was talking to some folks who were doing the plan, and seemed like there's still some wiggle room there, but being able to get some things in or not. So who knows? Maybe we can actually get some things in the plan, like USF reform or something like that, something minor. So with that, I thought we'd just I'd ask the panelists each take 5 minutes on identifying, one or two things that they think are critical to get in the broadband plan and perhaps how they would see them implemented. So I think what we'll do is we'll just go right down the line. So we'll start with Kathy.
Thank you, Rob. This just goes on, or we have to press a button? Are we fine? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Catholic University for having us here. And Dean Miles, thank you for using the droid. As you know, this is an amazing collaboration between Google and Verizon, one of the many, and Motorola. And it's a terrific competitive addition, I think, to the smartphone. So I'm glad you're using it on the Metro, of course. There is something that Eddie said this morning that Lara Levin had a terrific post yesterday that I want to amplify as what I think is one of the most important things that the SEC can do in this plan. Congress told them, please, we want to see a strategic plan for the United States. Can you take a hard look at this? And I applaud the SEC and the very openness of their processes. I think Eddie is right on that issue. He said, and at the very last, I think, is about the federal government, state and local governments really adopting a digital mentality. And I commend folks to Blair's blog yesterday, which was, I thought, a very smart piece about how this transformation that the president spoke about really goes to embracing the technologies of the 21st century. And that means in government, which is a huge, huge purchaser, but it also is a provider of services to the American people, both on the federal, state, and local level. And its ability and willingness and political will to actually transform itself will lead the way. My thesis is that the retail space will follow. But let me say a couple of words about what is really a scaling issue. And this is an issue that we at Verizon have done a lot of work on. How does technology scale? What does it scale? Let me give two quick examples where we saw it go fast in government. One in government, one in the commercial area. In government, think about the Department of Motor Vehicles only 20, 15 years ago when I was in state government. Every governor said, we can't stand this, because this is the place where citizens interacted with the government. It was horrible. You stood on long lines. One of the very first things that happened was the internet came to the Department of Motor Vehicles. And now in Virginia, you can do almost everything online. That was a huge success. Blair asked in his blog, what happens? Why does this work? Think about Medicare or Medicaid, on the other hand, and online applications there. Why is it not working? I have some ideas around this, and we have at Verizon that we should talk about, because in fact, when we see this kind of adoption at the government level, we see more take-up, we see deployment in households, because folks want to use the technology. We talk about applications, but really it's about services, right? It's about the ability to get things you need. So, in the commercial sector, of course, it was inventory. Over the last years, the inventory in the United States has been digitized so that you get what you need when you need it on the shelf. Think Kmart, think any of the large retail stores, think even your butcher shop. You don't get big sides of beef, you get pieces of it, you get inventory. That has made productivity soar. That kind of productivity, that kind of transformation is what you get in a broadband world, in a ubiquitous broadband world. We at Verizon applaud the 100 squared notion. We've been doing it for 4 years. Our Fios product is out there at 20 megabits. We're on the market at 35 megabits. We can be in the market at 50. We've tested 100. Our GPON is 10. It's huge, okay? So we're already out there providing what's going to cause people to adopt, as Eddie says, that fast speed. What are the services? And I submit there's one that's ready to go, and that's in the healthcare area. Because in the healthcare area, we can deliver services that take high broadband width. And if the government moves forward rapidly and aggressively, my view is the retail folks will follow.
Great, thank you. Brett?
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to Kathy for having us here this morning. I want to make a quick point on the process and a couple of substantive ideas to throw out there that we hope the broadband plan will incorporate. On the process side, it's kind of a strange thing. I think, unfortunately, the U.S. government, we're in a situation now where we have the philosophy of shoot, aim, then ready on broadband over the past year, and that's just a consequence of the way that Congress dealt with this issue, namely putting out resources as part of the ETOP program, and then the notion of having a 2-year mapping project, and then somewhere in the middle you figure out your policy framework. Ideally, of course, you want to have the plan be seen as the culmination of the process, not as something sort of in the middle of the process. And so it was good to hear Eddie say, as we've advocated in the proceeding, that the framework here should not be seen as the culmination of a proceeding, but the very beginning of a process. And that process should be iterative, flexible, adaptive. It should be constantly changing as markets and technologies change. You should adopt policies that seem to be working in some places and abandon policies that are not working in others. Be very bottoms up. Look at experiments happening at the state and local level. Not view this as kind of the paragon of the federal government pushing down its thinking on the rest of the world. Look to the market where you can, and where the market still shows some gaps, then the government should get in. So that's the approach we think should be taken here, and it does sound like that's where the plan is heading. On a few substantive ideas, the future of the web really kind of comes down to two things: mobility and video. And in both places, again, I think the plan seems to be taking some of the right measures as far as I can tell, but hopefully here's some additional thoughts. Spectrum inventory has to be a part of this. And again, this is part of this notion of get the information out there first. Some of our friends in the TV broadcaster space feel a bit put upon, I believe, because there's some folks around town who have argued, you know, hey, that spectrum looks good, you're not really using it for much of anything, let's just take it away from you. I think that's the wrong approach. It may well be that that spectrum can be used and should be used for other purposes, but we have to take a much broader viewpoint here. We have to look first at current spectrum uses. Is the spectrum that's out there now actually being used in efficient ways? And there are a couple of things particularly to point to. Are the market mechanisms functioning properly? Are secondary markets really doing what they're supposed to do, allowing people to trade and barter spectrum back and forth to fill current needs? Are technology mechanisms working? Are underlays and overlays, other kinds of real-time auctions, other kinds of mechanisms that are possible being utilized or being considered in ways to make the market more efficient? Then you can look at things like government spectrum. Obviously, that's been a discussion for many years at NTIA. I hope that continues. Broadcaster spectrum, sure, but again, as a piece of the puzzle, not as the panacea. And things like TD white spaces, where Google is a strong advocate, we need to move forward on making sure that the database is in place, that the recompetitions are dealt with, and we can move forward with actually providing services and devices. And then on the video side, the future of the television should be as the next great internet appliance, ready-made for rich video content. We know, of course, that there are many obstacles to get us from here to there. One of them, unfortunately, is a failed cable set-top box ecosystem. So we need prompt FCC action in the form of an NPRM to be launched by the National Broadband Plan to consider ways to give consumers real choices for these kinds of gateways, not as a mandate by government, but merely as an option, as a way that consumers can then pick and choose which forms of manner of using the television to get to the internet serves their interests best. And finally, the stretch goal, people have talked about the 100 squared. I thought that was actually the floor, not the ceiling, but that's fine, it's a good start. We announced a couple weeks ago that Google is going to be doing a test bed on 1 gig. We certainly are not trying to suggest that what Verizon is doing is not good and adequate. But from our perspective, there are a couple of things that we can help learn about this. And a lot of this is in fact a learning process for my company. One is just to better understand the technology. Are there ways to reduce the cost of deployment? Can we test some cool new bandwidth-hungry applications that aren't testable today on current systems? Can we operate a truly open network, both in terms of being non-discriminatory under the FCC standards, as well as with an ISP open access regime, so third parties can come in and utilize the infrastructure? Can we serve community anchor institutions in ways that haven't been served so far? Can we develop what we're calling the single play business model? The single play just being the web, give the user the ability to choose what they want from the internet rather than a preset package of offerings. And finally, can we generate useful supply and demand data from all this to share with the government and anybody else who's interested? So that's sort of our thinking around the 1 gig project, and we're pleased to see, at least at this point, that the chairman believes this is something that the FCC should be endorsing going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Joel.
Hi, thank you, and thank you to Catholic University for having us here. So I'm going to try to start with something old and end with something new. I'm going to start with the Recovery Act, because I think from our perspective, this is really kind of we kind of share the premise that the Recovery Act looks at broadband through the lens. With the Recovery Act, Congress and the White House kind of finally began, in our view, looking at broadband as an essential infrastructure question to this country, something that's essential to economic prosperity, to civic engagement and employment. And this kind of represents a real fundamental policy break from the past, looking rather than viewing broadband as a commercial service or an entertainment service that's available to consumers that are able to pay for it. And I think we've heard kind of similar language in a lot of the previews over the last few weeks with the National Broadband Plan. And this is a premise and a lens that we very much share. And while I think a lot of folks agree about universal service and trying to get as many folks throughout the nation connected to broadband as possible, not all share the view of treating broadband as a national infrastructure question, something that needs policy intervention, something that needs public support, something that needs a strong look and leadership from the federal government in terms of getting it built out to as many folks as possible at a cost that all can afford. So the question becomes, how do you then meet these goals these kind of lofty goals of adoption and access? So you start where most would, which is measuring the problem. And I think we have a couple of new studies that have just come out from the NTIA and from FCC in the past few weeks that do a good job of this, and I think paint a very interesting dynamic. The 2 points that I kind of bring away from the recent NTIA study the more extensive FCC report that came out last week, is that there's still very much a digital divide, but it's starting to shift from geographic terms to kind of a divide between low-income and middle-income households. There's very much still a divide when it comes to rural and urban areas. It's closing a little bit. If you look at the stats between 2007 and 2009, the differential closed from 15% to 11.8%. That is, there's a 15% difference between urban households adopting broadband and rural households adopting broadband between 2007 and 2009. It's much less at 11.8%. But the change in adoption rates with regard to household incomes shows a little bit of a different picture. The biggest movement there is with middle incomes, so 50 to 35 up to $70,000 or $80,000 per household. At the ends of those curves, the very low income households and the very high income households, the change in folks adopting broadband is much smaller. And so to us, if you look at that and then you kind of combine the not surprising findings that they had on cost being a leading gating factor for consumers choosing to adopt broadband, that kind of leads me to my second point, which is even when you do teach the value of the internet, which we think is very important, and there's a role for government, there's a role for private industry in doing that, even when you teach the value of broadband and you provide services, government services, education services, healthcare services, there's still cost as a gating factor to getting people online. And if you look at that, you can see, I think, very clear from the numbers that among the respondents that the NTI found that don't use the internet anywhere at all, whether it's at school, in a library, or at home, 47% cited a lack of interest. That's a pretty high number, not cost, lack of interest as their gating factor. But if you look at those that don't have it at home, which is about 39% of all Americans, but do use it somewhere else, school, at a library, have dial-up but not broadband at home. Cost is the #1 gating factor for all of those Americans. The cost of broadband service to their home is the #1 factor that they haven't yet signed up for service. So if you believe that broadband is a fundamental component to the infrastructure of our country, if you believe that universal access is a good thing, and the data are showing us that cost is the primary obstacle to folks adopting broadband, the question is, how do you not only expand and build out broadband, but how do you also lower cost? From our perspective, I think we recognize that private investment has a huge role to play here, but we don't think it's the only role. We don't think it's the only solution. We think that policy needs to help encourage build out, needs to help encourage competition, needs to invest public money into the problem, and also play a large role. So a number of consumer groups have filed in the National Broadband Docket, most recently, a pretty short, if you look at, on average, all of the filings that have gone to the docket, a pretty short filing that kind of tries to very concisely list 5 of the major policy solutions or recommendations that all of the public interest and consumer community agrees with. And I'll quickly tick through those. First, that the FCC should be bold. It should set a goal that U.S. broadband adoption of world-class networks should equal the current rate of telephone adoption, which is about 95% of all Americans by 2020. And again, we're focusing here not on access, but we're focusing on adoption, because when you look at the way that the telephone networks and the way that the federal government looked at the telephone networks over the past several decades, it was about how do you get folks adopting the service, not just how do you build it to their home. And again, cost is a major component to that. So to accomplish that, we think that the Universal Service Fund needs a facelift, to say the least. We think that Lifeline and Link-Up program and future public funding similar to the Stimulus Act need to be employed, and that the FCC should absolutely invest in digital literacy and digital skills programs. Second, the FCC should set a goal of substantially improving the level of competition between providers of broadband access to move the country out of what we view as kind of a stagnant duopoly dynamic right now by the end of 2012. Specifically, by the end of 2012, the Commission should adopt ongoing market analysis that would look at and include specific triggers for policy intervention based on where the level of competition exists or doesn't in particular geographic areas throughout the country. Third, we believe that the FCC should set a goal of establishing real consumer protections for broadband customers within 12 to 18 months. This is the truth in billing, truth in labeling, docket that we've extensively filed in, believing that not only in wireless but also in the wireline service, there can be a lot more done to require consistent and meaningful disclosure of information to consumers to help them make better decisions in the marketplace.
One more minute.
Fourth, I can wrap it up in a minute, no problem. Fourth, the FCC should set a goal of implementing new broadband data collection standards and rules for utilizing that data and market analysis by the end of 2010. Specifically, we think the FCC could collect a lot more information on the use of spectrum. We think it should reform the way that it looks at Form 477 data, not just reporting the number of broadband providers that offer service within a census tract, but actually look at the real consumer perspective. How many choices does a consumer actually have on average in a census tract? Fifth, and lastly, the FCC should set a goal of establishing rules to protect open markets for speech and commerce on broadband networks as soon as possible. We believe that they should move to the net neutrality rulemaking as soon as they possibly can to establish common rules of the road for both consumers, innovators at the edge, and also competitive broadband networks. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
I mean, I think there's consensus on the panel on all of those points, so we won't even need to get into those later. So, David, why don't you just concur?
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the setup on that one. From CTI's perspective, and really I feel that this is sort of the trade association role, our goal here is to see that the National Broadband Plan recognizes what has been the success of the broadband space, which is wireless. We're a competitive market. Wireless is the fastest growing area of broadband adoption, and we think that there's a good chance for the FCC to use the National Broadband Plan to really focus on what's going right here. It was really heartening for us to hear both press reports and then Eddie Lazarus this morning talking about focus on spectrum and focus on mobile, and moving forward to make sure that wireless carriers have the resources they need to continue to bring Americans broadband and mobile broadband. And that's really the important part here. And I think that Rick really hit the nail on the head when he said it's mobility and video. And I think those two will sort of encapsulate why we have a need for so much more spectrum. YouTube, which is part of Google, had very interesting statistics, and these are now a year old, but they're interesting nonetheless. In the first half of last year, their mobile uploads increased 1,400%, and their mobile uploads increased 400% per day for the week following the launch of the iPhone 3GS. If those numbers don't give you an idea of how interested American consumers are in both mobility and video, I'm not sure what will. The spectrum piece the chairman's going to cover later today, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say about National Broadband Plan spectrum. But let's not forget that wireless is important to the other aspects of the National Broadband Plan as well. The national purposes, wireless has a critical role to play there, particularly in the smart grid arena through M2M communications and the M health arena. Currently, over existing 3G networks, we have a number of applications for doctors that allow them to do remote monitoring and medical telemetry through their existing commercial devices. And lastly, the other area that I really would like to see the National Broadband Plan focus on wireless is adoption. Well, a lot of people have really focused on the fact that these studies come out and say we're 16th, 14th, pick your number. The one thing that's not really focused on is that the United States leads the world in high-speed broadband users over mobility. 23%. We have two platforms in wireless, sort of the GSM track and the CDMA track. The United States has 23% of the world's GSM users that are using HSPA. That is far and away the most. And in the CDMA world, the United States has 59% of the EVDO users. It's clear that Americans are adopting higher speed wireless. And as we move towards 4G, and Clearwire is out there with WiMAX now. Verizon and AT&T have both announced that they're moving forward with their LTE rollout later this year and early next year. You're going to see real speed increases over wireless broadband, and mobility will be a key factor to continuing our growth.
Great, thank you. Roger.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you, Catholic University. I'm representing the small cable operators, American Cable Association. We represent nearly 900 small and medium-sized cable operators located in smaller markets in rural areas across the country. They're not only cable operators, they're also broadband providers, and they've gotten into the telephone industry as well. Today, close to 80 to 90% of our members are offering broadband speeds. Most of the way they've gotten here has mostly been through private investment and upgrades through their cable systems. They were traditionally for decades analog systems. When they saw the need to upgrade into digital systems, they made their own investments in the market to do that. And today, through those investments, they've been able to offer launch broadband as well as telephone service in a lot of areas that you wouldn't necessarily think have that kind of service. And with the promise of DOCSIS 3.0, there's a lot of promise that actually small cable operators can deliver on a lot of the hopes that the chairman, Congress, and the commission of 100 megabit speeds. And we're excited, and our members are capable of launching that without significant upgrades to their plants or to their wires. And that will be done largely through private investments. With that said, the FCC can play an important role in encouraging further development, deployment, and adoption in certain areas. Number one, increasing the availability of middle mile infrastructure. Two, changing set-top box rules that will reduce costs as well as free up spectrum that can be used for broadband. Three, reforming the USF program to be used for broadband. And four, dealing with adoption to curb some of the business models we're seeing coming out from programmers that will push higher costs on consumers, and I'll get to that in a minute. First, dealing with middle mile. As discussed, our members have the ability to offer 100 megabit service through DOCSIS 3.0. However, the big hurdle for them and the bottleneck is middle mile. In small markets and rural areas, a lot of the availability in terms of the backhaul is through T1 lines, which are incapable of servicing 100 megabits. We're encouraged that the NTIA and the FCC has put some interest in trying to solve this middle mile problem and understand where it is and where it isn't. And we're hopeful because a lot of our members don't have the resources to send fiber from the nearest connect point to their small markets. And there's going to need to be assistance in doing that. And that's not only good for our members and our customers, but it's going to also be important for hospitals and universities and others that would need that. With regards to set-top boxes, we're encouraged that the FCC is looking into these rules. From our perspective, the set-top box rules were changed in 2007 in order to make sure that they have a removable cable card dealing with security issues. The impact of that has been to drive up the cost of those set-top boxes. For a lot of our members at the time that occurred had business models that would take them from analog systems to digital systems, and in doing so, free up spectrum. A lot of those plans have had to be put on hold because the costs of those boxes that they needed in order to make that transition drove up so high. So we're hopeful with new rules, they'll be able to find new ways to lower the cost of those boxes, which would both allow them to continue their transition to digital, freeing up the spectrum that they need freeing up the bandwidth they'll need for DOCSIS 3.0, and as well as freeing up resources they can use for further broadband deployment. However, we can't do it all on our own. We know that, and there are areas that are still unserved today. The USF program is going to be an important component of ensuring that places that don't have service now will get it. From our perspective, and we represent both cable operators, and we have a segment of our membership that's telephone companies. We've gone through a process to try to figure out how to address this, similar to what the commission has gone through in trying to manage a lot of different interests. In short, we believe there needs to be a transition of the program from the current USF to broadband. We need to cap the fund. We believe that the growth of the fund is making it unsustainable. We believe we need to find quick ways to move that money from current USF to next generation, to broadband services, and then open up a program where it's technology neutral and industry neutral, where both cable operators and telephone operators have an option of getting that money. And in order to make that money go further, we believe that first the money should be used for capital investments. Build the infrastructure. Let's see if somebody who owns that infrastructure can make it work without operating subsidies, and then provide operating subsidies where necessary. And finally, With regards to adoption, you know, part of what came out, I believe, yesterday, in terms of their service, that 15% of non-adopters said they do not have home broadband service because the monthly fee is too high. A lot of our members have maintained the price for broadband over since they've launched it. However, what they're seeing in the future is a migration of the business model that's been happening on the cable side to the internet side. In which, if you want to, where programmers, and let me give an example, Disney has an ESPN 360 business model, where they put popular sports content on that. They tell our operators, if you want to carry that content and offer it to your customers, even one, you have to offer it to all of your customers. And for our members who want to make sure they're staying competitive by offering it, have to end up paying the price for all of their customers, and those costs end up getting passed on to the consumers. And Wall Street has encouraged these kind of business models from programmers. If we see this continuing amongst other programmers, that's going to put an enormous cost of pressure on our members, which are going to be increasing costs for consumers. We believe that, you know, our members should be able to offer an internet service absent any types of forced programming, and we're not in the same situation like we have run into with the cable business. So that.
Great. I don't think I've ever moderated a panel in 10 years where people have kept to the time. So this is really very impressive. Let me, I know I said that we wouldn't speculate, but I'm going to speculate that let me actually first of all say I'm extremely impressed with what Blair and his team have done on the broadband plan. I think it's to me one of the best things the federal government's done in 2 decades, and that's all without having seen the plan. But 2 weeks from now, I'll maybe change my tune. But the plan, obviously, I don't think everyone will like everything in the plan, but from what I've heard of it, I think overall it's really an excellent effort. However, let me speculate by saying I think that the odds are that I would suspect there isn't going to be a lot of new money in that plan, that they're putting together a plan with some fairly stringent budget constraints, not coming from their shop, I would argue, but from some other shop that's farther downtown. So given that there are probably going to be budget constraints in this plan, I'd like to ask everyone, what is one thing you think the plan can do or should do that's sort of a no-cost thing, that's something that's pretty free or cheap, whether it's moving money from one box to another or something on the regulatory side or the leadership side, that isn't going to cost a lot of money but can maybe move the ball forward. So let's start with Kathy.
So I'm going to stay with my theme. I think that the biggest challenge for the FCC, which obviously doesn't have authority over budgets of other federal, state, and local agencies, is to be a catalyst for the money that's already there to be used to re-engineer the way government is done. Just like every business over the last 10 years has had to embrace a digital culture, I liked Blair's term, the government has to embrace a digital culture, and that means that scarce budget dollars need to be used to bring yourself technologically into the future. And I would make 2 points there. One, that the use of these technologies inside government makes government more efficient, number one. But number 2, use of the technologies that are already available. So cable's out there, BIOS is out there, broadband deployment is happening, wireless smartphones are proliferating. Using the technologies that are now available to actually deliver services to constituents seems to be smart, but you have to be smart about the way you deliver services. Thus, you take the point on a mobile phone. There are some applications, so my friends at Google love the word applications. I like the word services. What's delivered over this technology to citizens? Services. What services can the government deliver more efficiently, more effectively to its very constituents over the broadband networks, wired and wireless, that are already out there, causing, in my view, more people to adopt the technology because there's an actual use for them. and on the medical side, it's a proven case, that if the doctor can see the patient, for instance, and this is where video is so important, they can actually diagnose over the technology, right? So first, the technology is there, but second, the standards have to be in place for insurance companies and others to allow it. And to Eddie's point, which we agree with, these technologies have to be interoperable. We agree that the government has a role here to do standardization, make sure they're interoperable, and then have governments actually, in each of these agencies, think about how their services can be delivered over broadband.
Great, thank you. Rick?
Much as you all like the services over applications, we like users or producers over consumers, but that's just a small
Our patients.
patience. Yes. So here's literally a concrete suggestion, which is to say anytime that there's a federally funded infrastructure project, new roads, new buildings, new schools, new anything, or whether you're digging up the roads for a second or third time to patch them up or to improve their viability, that you add fiber conduit, that be a mandate all across the country as every federally funded project. By adding the conduit, it helps take care, in some sense, of the middle mile issues. And that conduit can be open to anybody, so not just necessarily the local franchised cable company or the local telephone company, but anybody who wants to put a fiber in there, obviously meeting certain requirements, will be allowed to do so. So it'll be an open source type conduit system. That may not, in year 1 or year 2, make a big difference, but by year 5 or year 10, given the amount of money the federal government spends on infrastructure, it could make a real difference.
Great, thanks. Joel?
So you asked for one, but I'm going to give you three. Better promise to make it quick. First and foremost, I think universal service fund reform. I think that's, I need to find a USF expert, but if you add in Lifeline link up the high cost funds and all of the funds and funding available through USF, that's somewhere between $7 and $10 billion a year. It's off books. Targeting it towards broadband infrastructure in ways that build out to geographic areas and focusing on need rather than access, I think are two big things that we'll be looking for. And we think that the Commission absolutely can and should do that would help not only promote competition and lower costs for consumers. Second is special access reform. That doesn't take any money for the federal government to reform the special access rules. From our perspective, the choke points at the middle mile networks that have allowed a few companies to really jack up special access rates, in our opinion, really depresses end user competition. And if you reform special access rates to be more reflective of the market and help encourage competition and be more reasonably priced to their competitors, is something that would do leaps and bounds for consumers. And then third is spectrum. I think we all kind of agree that this nation needs to take a hard look at spectrum in the coming months and years and figure out not only how to keep a better inventory of the uses that spectrum is being used for right now, but also figure out how to allocate it better and how to make it more widely available so that consumers can realize a lot of the benefits of mobile broadband. I think there's money to be made for the government there. We've always been very skeptical of a lot of the auction schemes that have come in the past because it results in too few companies getting the lion's share of the spectrum. But I think if it's done right, it could mean good things for the federal government, good things for consumers, good things for private companies.
Great. David?
Find myself in the awkward position of mostly agreeing with Joel. Certainly on USF, I think everyone on the panel agrees that USF can be better targeted. I think we all have different ideas of exactly how that would be done, but there is a growing momentum to actually get something done on moving USF to a 21st century model. We certainly, from CTI's perspective, agree that additional spectrum should be auctioned. Not only is that not going to cost money to the FCC, it actually will bring money into the U.S. Treasury through auction revenues. But I think the most important thing that can be done that's low cost, and Eddie Lazarus hit on this this morning, is lowering barriers to private investment in networks. And we're seeing this already come forward. Some of the things that CTI asked for in the National Broadband Plan comments and replies, the tower siting shot clock that we had asked for, and of course is now currently being challenged in the courts, went through, certainly gives us more certainty and our member companies more certainty in terms of building out their existing wireless networks. the additional spectrum, and then the other things like pole attachments and sort of moving that docket that has been languishing at the FCC along, as well as rights of way.
Thanks. Ross?
I'll repeat, I guess something that I've already talked about is dealing with the cost of set-top boxes. And the commission is going through, is looking at this process from a number of different perspectives. And one is, can it be reformed into a gateway product that a lot of different companies and services can tap into? And there's going to need to be standards, and that's going to be a long process. And that's one where there's debate over should be an NOI or an NPRM. But essentially what they can do in the meantime, and that could be, like I said, a long process, is look at small cable operators and say, what do they need to be able to deploy broadband? If they could say immediately, let's grant a waiver so they don't have to abide by current set-top box rules while we develop a new service. That would allow them to go all digital quicker. That would allow them to free up resources where they can take money they're now spending, and this is artificially high costs because it's through a government regulation that was imposed where you had to have a cable card slot in this. If you eliminate that, you can then free up that money, not reducing the services to consumers, and then use that money for deployment of DOCSIS 3.0 boxes or other things like that. So through regulation, you don't really add any costs to the government in that way.
Several people mentioned spectrum auctions. Maybe we could convince OMB to don't give the plan any money, just let the plan keep the money they're going to get from new auctions. But I have a feeling even that's not going to fly in this environment. I want to ask the panel one more question, and a short one, and then open it up to you all. There's several of you described or discussed the issue of middle mile, and how much of hard to pin you down exactly, but sort of in general terms, how much, if we're talking about deployment strategies as a component of the plan, as opposed to adoption strategies, or as Kathy talked about, government strategies around applications or services, how much of the plan focus should be on middle mile deployment versus last mile deployment? What's the right balance there for the plan to get right? Kathy?
You know, I think HIA, and I applaud Larry Strickling's focus on this, correctly looked at the middle mile as a problem. I would just, and we could probably, Joel and I, talk more about this, but in terms of the cost factor, it is high to transport from a small rural town to a population center, so all of us know that. Part of this, though, and I want to correct the record team here, most of that transport is actually regulated now because there's no competition there. So under price caps, it is a regulated price under which that is done. Actually, having more construction of middle mile is a very good, in my view, strategy to lower the cost at the end for users. Because then smaller entrepreneurs, smaller, big and small, but the small cable guys, for instance, the wireless folks, remember wireless only goes to the wired network, okay? So cell towers, et cetera, at the end, all become cheaper to operate. And thus, this is a good strategy. Now, there is probably a difference of opinion on whether and how you, quote, have an open source middle mile. And we can talk about this. The question becomes, who operates that? Does the government operate that? The government is not very good at operating networks. Does some not-for-profit group do that? Well, how is it sustainable? Or do existing companies do that? In which case, do they do it under tariff? In which case, they have to let everybody on anyway. I don't want to get into a philosophical argument here because I don't think there's a need to. I think we probably can work this through and think this through, and I do think it's an important piece.
Great.
Yeah, just to be clear, I was calling it open source conduit. So all it means is just it's an opening that's available for people to put their fibers in the ground. So I wasn't suggesting government runs a new network or anything like that, but it seems like a simple measure that allows much quicker access to put fiber someplace, and over time for people to build multiple competing networks is actually a good thing. You need both first mile and middle mile. You can't have one or the other. And I think one of the real issues is in the rural areas. Disproportionately, I think, and I think most people agree, that's where the biggest problem is. You have certainly long loop lengths is an issue there, but middle mile in some places is virtually non-existent. And so it is a real problem. And wireless providers talk about it, the anchor institutions talk about it, large business users even talk about it. In some places they have some problems. So I think it really is something that needs to be part of the analysis in the plan. And as I mentioned before, it has to be an iterative process going forward. We have to take more evidence, look at all the various options, some of the regulatory solutions possibly, and then make some hard decisions.
Joel, on this question?
So, we probably have varying different ideas of special access, but one thing I think we all agree on is that we have to bring the middle mile closer to the end user, particularly in rural areas. I think, one of the last numbers I looked at, most rural markets are something like 90 miles from a backbone. And I think Kat is right that that's costly. I think one of the things driving that cost for a lot of competitive carriers are special access rates where the price caps have been lifted. And so we should look at that absolutely. But the balance is a really good, that's a very, very good question. How do you figure out the balance between middle mile and mile investment? I think that in places like urban markets where you might have more, actually we call it first mile because it's the first mile the consumer experiences the internet over. So in places like urban markets where you have a number of first mile competitors, you might look at policies that reform the middle mile more to try to help bring down costs and lower barriers to entry for more competitors. In places like rural areas where it's just not economical for 4 or 5, high-speed internet providers to offer service, you need to figure out a way to focus on that first mile and figure out how to use USF funding and other and maybe some smart spectrum plans to give broadband to the consumers that live there. But across both that urban and rural dynamic, I think we absolutely have to figure out a way to bring the middle mile closer to those end networks and start closing the distance between those local loops.
David?
From CTI's perspective, the first mile, last mile, whichever you'd like to call it, is certainly what we have been focused on. The spectrum constraint issue and the need for additional spectrum for last mile, first mile is a real issue for wireless providers to continue to meet demand. So bringing middle mile closer to the cell site may speed up traffic, but at the end of the day, if your bottleneck is going to be because you're spectrum constrained, the focus should be on making sure that consumers get more access on that mile.
Do you think your spectrum constraint is more right now on the last mile over the air, or in some markets also because of the T1 or other lines coming from your towers?
I'm sure for some carriers it's going to be the T1 that is the problem, but the real crunch right now is the spectrum link. That's the real concern for the majority of our wireless carriers. Quite frankly, we're behind the rest of the world in terms of bringing allocations to market, and we're way behind the rest of the world in spectrum that is in the pipeline that's tagged to be reallocated. We have 50 megahertz identified in the U.S. Basically, H block, J block, D block. There's not much, and AWS3 are currently tagged for wireless. You look at Japan, they have 165 megahertz in the pipeline. You look at Germany, they have 340 megahertz in the pipeline, because they have about the same amount of spectrum as we have, and Europe has not completed their, what they call the digital dividend, what we call the DTV transition. So I think that's really the issue for our members, is getting that additional last mile.
Okay, thank you. Ross?
As I said before, middle mile is a big problem for a lot of our members who currently have the facilities to offer much faster speeds than they do today. And making that middle mile available to them would assist in delivering that service. I think that one of the initial problems with a lot of this is accurate mapping of where middle mile is and where middle mile isn't. After you engage in that process, and I think the process is ongoing, you can then start to strategize on how best to get middle mile closer to the areas where it needs to be. I think where there are facilities available that can take advantage of that middle mile, we should be focusing on middle mile and let the market work to upgrade those services from the last mile. Where there isn't any last mile service or adequate last mile service, I think then it's it's a chicken and egg thing, which is better to do first or not, so.
Okay, great. We've got a fair amount of time, partly because we started early, so if you all have questions, if you want to raise your hand and identify yourself and who your question to. Because if you don't, I've got a whole lot more I can ask, but I'd rather hear yours. Yes.
Hi, I have a question for Rick Witt from Google. I personally am transfixed with the concept of going through hyperspace and coming out at 1 gigabit per second of throughput. And I don't mean to get into hardcore educating, but that's the business that I'm in. So I remind people that there are 1,000 kilobits in a megabit, and there are 1,000 megabits in a gigabit. And I drop a footnote to tell you that I bought my first terabyte outboard hard drive memory device this past weekend, another 1,000-fold increase. But going from some of the definitions that have been used in the notices of funding availability of broadband shall be defined as a symmetrical 5 megabit per second circuit to the 100 square concept of the chairman, and then putting into context what Google has in mind. I ask, is Google conceiving a hard conduit connection like fiber where, yeah, you could do a gigabit or more? Or is Google also looking at wireless? I mean, what is the underlying platform or platforms of Google's gigabit delivery internet concept?
Sure. So first off, just to stress that it is a test bed. We're going to choose anywhere from 1 to 3 communities to up to 500,000 people. So it's a significant test bed, but it is just that's an experiment. The experiment is going to be based on fiber. We still believe fiber is the single best resource out there to be able to carry that much traffic. As someone, we were talking about middle mile in the previous question, that's going to be a hurdle. No matter where we end up going, trying to find a middle mile or build or overbuild middle mile capacity to handle that kind of traffic, at least over a period of time, right? I mean, initially, it's required for any typical consumer to fill up their 1 gig pipe, but we're hopeful. But it will be based on fiber. Now, there may be some wireless components there as well in terms of things we may offer to people in addition to the 1 gig fiber, but that's the basic platform.
Thank you.
If I just jump in.
Go ahead.
Okay, so what's Verizon doing? Verizon has a fiber play going on right now. Most of you know it to be Fios. Most of you know it to be in the market at about 10 and 20 megabits, right? And we have a 2020 symmetrical. This is available to 15 million homes right now. And when you look at what the take-up is here, and this is important, and by the way, we applaud new sort of test beds. We do it ourselves to figure out what consumers need and want. What we find is that they're buying at about 10 megabits. That work-at-home folks like a symmetrical 20-20, 20 up, 20 down, but few are looking for their terabytes in their house right now. I mean, for commercial sale. That doesn't mean, by the way, this won't get there. And it doesn't mean that a network that's being built now, as RCL calls it, it should be future-proof, and that is that it should have the ability then to go to that capacity. So recently then, so our technology right now is GPON, right? So it's a GPON technology that will indeed allow us to go to these ultra speeds. And we have had a test where we actually get, and I think we were written up on this, 10 gigabits per second through the Fios network that is now in the ground. On a shared basis, we believe it's 1 gig per second, you know, if you look at it in a neighborhood. So the technology is possible. We're going to watch and probably think through with Google how people would actually use that kind of speed. But clearly the fiber platform, which we are deploying right now across 19 states, is the platform. We think the DOCSIS guys are going to tell me they can do it too. But we believe that's the platform that's going to support those kinds of speeds.
And to be clear, again, we applaud Verizon. We wish there were other providers, large providers in this country, whose names I can't remember right now. We also put fiber to the home. But the one element I need to keep in mind is we see really a mutual synergy between the networks, the users, and the applications providers, right? So I mean, we're a software company. And it's really hard to know at this point what kinds of really cool applications could be out there, but they're not, because they can't build it just for Fios. They need to build it for all the other networks around the country, which typically have speeds that don't match where Fios is. So this is one of the things we're trying to test out. Let's bring some people in that we know in the community. Let's work on some really cool, nifty things, and if it's a proof of concept and it demonstrates and people like it when they use it, maybe that's a way to help push the envelope a little bit in terms of the market and developing the right kinds of synergy there.
I would offer a commercial for a report we issued last, I think, March, called The Need for Speed, which is on our website. That is actually a long analysis of what are some of the applications that are either in the marketplace or emerging that are going to essentially require much higher network speeds than we have today. So there's that question right, ma'am right there, lady right there, and then up here.
Good morning, I'm Stephanie Joyce from Parent Box. Kathy, you mentioned in your remarks that one cost-free idea the government organization specifically could implement is standardization and interoperability. Ed Lazarus also mentioned that this morning. My question is, included in that concept of standardization, this goes to any panelist, do you view the reasonable network management practices concept that is wrapped in the open internet proceeding as among the items that should be standardized and adopted by the FCC?
We've had a lot of discussions about what reasonable network management even is. And one of the concepts I think that Google and Verizon put on the table was a need for a norming process. I use the word norming because I worry about the word standardization because it just has so much baggage. But what's caused some ripples in the water, and it's one case, I keep pointing to one case, was the notion that there wasn't an understanding, first, a transparent understanding of what was going on. And secondly, a notion of what was a norm, right? And so what was acceptable or not acceptable. And we actually, Rick and I have worked very hard on this, have talked about an industry effort to really think through these notions of norms in network management. We're hoping actually that we get some traction on this and actually get that up and going fairly soon to sort of have those engineer kind of conversations and really quiet the waters on this, because we actually think that there's a way to work through this that can be transparent and also can get some results.
Yeah, I would say it's relatively easy to say, here's a standard. It's much harder to say, okay, the second and third level down, what's the standard apply to, what's the particulars of the case. That's where, I think Verizon and Google have suggested we need to reach beyond the four corners of the FCC and develop a broad-based group that includes members of the industry, folks in the consumer and public interest camps, but be technical experts, engineers, right? Leave your law firm and lawyer credentials at the door and talk about the technical issues involved in this area. So I was on the panel yesterday actually at ITIF, and I mentioned actually I don't really care what you call the standard, whether it's Title II traditional standard versus the Computer 3 slash BTOP, more straightforward standard non-discrimination. Yesterday I suggested the word FRED. Let's just call it FRED, and just put it aside for a moment and figure out what are the practices we think are acceptable or unacceptable, and kind of two extremes. And then what in the middle are there shades of gray? And then let's have this technical group start talking about it, start working together on network management terms and what we think the network should be able to do and not do, and use that as kind of case-by-case evolving process going forward. So that's kind of, I think, the notion that we have. We may not be in full agreement on some of the particulars and all, but I think that, to me, that's a better approach than for example, just letting the FCC handle all of it on its own, or get more prescriptive in terms of real details that may or may not make sense, down the road.
Rick, there's one major problem with the caveat in your proposal, which is that it would mean that there are less lawyer hours that are going to be billable. But much of this would be resolved before.
But that's in the public interest, I believe.
Rob, if I can chime in on that as well. I mean, wireless has been fairly outspoken on reasonable network management. From the get-go, we firmly believe and continue to believe that the policy statement, the internet policy statement, did not and does not apply to wireless. It was a wireline and cable adopted model, doesn't apply to the wireless industry. And we've said it a number of times, and it's sort of picked up traction, but wireless is different. No matter how you cut it, you can't drag a fiber around in your car and take it from place to place or on the metro. Mobility makes us different, and as a result, we do not think that standardizing what is a reasonable network management practice makes sense across all the different broadband platforms, let alone even across one wireless provider to the next. Spectrum-constrained providers in certain markets will use different tools to ensure quality of service than those providers that have enough spectrum in a given area to provide a higher level of service. I don't think that what we want to see from our perspective is a static set of standard rules that will freeze what's going on in the wireless space right now. We're an evolving industry. 3G is out there, 4G is coming. I don't think anyone knows what the infrastructure providers that build the base stations and build the switches for our networks are going to come forward with, but I can assure you that if the folks in this room that do this every day don't know, I don't think that the FCC is going to have any better idea of what exactly is coming down the pike in a year. Strangely enough, I think if you end up freezing and standardizing what is reasonable network management, you end up actually imposing the exact, I know we've gotten off into the net neutrality world now, not necessarily the national broadband plan world, but you end up taking this concept of liberating innovators and the ability to innovate without permission, but you impose the exact opposite upon infrastructure providers. So the folks that are building these pieces of equipment for our network are going to essentially have to ask the FCC, is this new thing that we want to invest a lot of R&D money in going to be shot down? You don't have a rule that addresses it, your standards aren't clear enough for us, and don't get me wrong, everyone in this room will make a lot of money on the billable hours, as Rob pointed out, but it's not necessarily good for developing the wireless broadband ecosystem. And I'm sure Joel is now going to...
Yeah, I'll jump in now. so the one thing I couldn't agree with you
We're
more
going
is
to
that...
debate with Adam and Ben later. Adam, enjoy yourself.
I actually couldn't agree with you more that the rule as it's written now is too ambiguous and too circular. But yes, absolutely, we do believe that reasonable network management standards need to be applied both to the wireless and the wireline broadband world. And we don't think that, from our perspective at least, I don't conceive a white hat, black hat kind of list of practices in either the wireless or the wireline world. Not only is that not future-proof, but it's untenable for the FCC to be able to do that. And I do agree that wireless is very, very different from wireline, which is why I think that the idea that consumers would have different opportunities and a different kind of software that they can download or different kind of rules of the road when it comes to using their mobile device than it does when they plug it into the wall is, I think, something that they very much, would be very, very foreign to them. So all of that is one of the reasons why we've very much advocated that the FCC put some very clear criteria around what the reasonable network management principle and standards are. And the two biggest are, number one, that it's focusing on means, that the means in which you're using the tools to manage your network and ensure quality of service are narrowly tailored for a very specific reason, and that you show that there is a need, there actually is congestion over your network that forces you to use this tool or employ this tool that would somehow interfere with the best efforts nature of the internet. And then second, that it's temporal. Right? That if you're using it and the idea that you're employing this tool is because there's congestion over your network and you want to be able to ensure quality of service, then when you either A, invest in your network to build out capacity, or B, during times when there isn't congestion in your network, that practice is no longer being employed. The problem is when you start using those practices in ways that happen to support your either other business models in different sectors of the telecom world, or you use it to somehow negatively impact your competitors, or you use it in a way that tries to get money from edge innovators that are trying to work on a level playing field to reach all consumers. From our perspective, that's something that's bad. It's something that fundamentally changes the nature of the internet. It takes away from the power of consumer demand to choose who the winners and losers in this marketplace are based on price, based on quality of service, based on the relevance of software applications to their life, and things like that. So absolutely, we think that reasonable network management standards are essential, and we don't want the FCC to play mother may I, but we do think that both consumers, innovators at the edge, network providers, both large and small, deserve rules of the road under which to operate.
I think the one thing we both agree on is that at the end of the day, there's no wireless provider out there that's saying, we don't want to give more to consumers. It's not a winning business model. At the end of the day, our providers want to bring more to wireless. We disagree on the means of how to bring more to our consumers, but I think we're at least in line on that.
So let me suggest that we all continue that conversation next Tuesday at 9 o'clock at ITIF, because we're releasing a report on the mobile internet, the future of the mobile internet, that's focusing on two big issues, spectrum and network management. And actually it should be an interesting debate, because we've got people sort of on all sides of the spectrum there, and a fairly serious report that Richard Bennett's going to be releasing, so if you want to go to that, it's on our website. But,
You've got as many ads in there as I did.
I try to restrain myself. I can't opine here, so I can only do ads. I think there's a gentleman here and then here, so yes, sir.
Sure, for Rick, please. What have you learned in the course of watching other municipalities try to do a fiber network of their own that guides you, lessons learned as far as how you're going to be able to pull this off more successfully in some specific community?
Well, part of this actually is to discover some of those lessons learned. I mean, we've been fortunate. We've talked to a number of people throughout the country who have put some really interesting projects in place, and they encounter obstacles both real and artificial. And so part of what we want to do here is sort of uncover and bring some light to what are the legitimate hurdles to bringing fiber, in particular fiber networks, even some of the wireless networks, to consumers, and what are the things that maybe should be reformed, right? We've already had a conversation with our friends at NATOA, and there's this concept of maybe developing sort of best practices approach to say, here are the things that kind of, if both sides agree, we want to build big networks in a timely fashion that serve consumers, what are kind of the checklists that should be developed that communities can turn to, maybe make the process a little quicker, maybe make it a little less problematic for those who want to be either first-time builders or overbuilders in an area. So we're very humble about not knowing all the answers yet. That's the whole point of trying this experiment out. But one of the things we do want to do is share these results with others who are interested, so maybe it can help, again, kind of move the ball a little bit on trying to lower some of those barriers.
Yes, sir.
When we address the network management issue, we see statistics that a very small percentage of the users constitute a very large percentage of the traffic. And if you want to give value judgments to it, someone can say it's just shoving movies around, and some of them are illegally copyright violations and so on. But one thing that would clearly avoid the need for some of the network management would be a pricing tool which would discourage the very, very heavy users or make them pay their freight. The other side of that is that the freight innovator will be stifled somewhere because he couldn't afford the capacity. Joel, what does Consumers Union feel about some kind of either a threshold above which you pay extra or measured service?
That's actually a very, very good question. Pricing tools, bandwidth caps, things like that, I think from our perspective, we'd be much more comfortable kind of diving into that if there was more truth in broadband advertising, if we actually had real information and data on what actual speeds were rather than advertised speeds, and what consumers are actually paying kind of almost per unit if you look at it, right? So if the pricing is artificial, we're not interested in it. If the pricing is real, then I think we can have a real conversation about it. One of the things you mentioned, a disproportionate amount of users take up a lot of the capacity. One of the things that we very much support and we're very big fans of was what Comcast employed after the BitTorrent case, They went out and they said, look, 1-2% of our users are using a disproportionate amount of our network. So at different peak hours, between the hours of, let's say, 5 and 9 or 4 and 8 or whatever it was, we're going to slow down the speeds to those particular users across the board, across all applications, not just particular applications. That we think was, and they disclosed that up front to the commission, to those consumers, and they were transparent about it. That was, in our view, a very responsible network management practice, and something that we don't believe would violate any of the recommendations we've made to the SEC when employing net neutrality or instituting net neutrality rules.
If I can chime in for a second also, I think that certainly seems to have a little bit of a ring of truth to it if you're talking about a static service, right? So if you're talking about service to a home, where you can measure that sort of thing, that would make sense. It'd be a decent approach. For us, the dynamic nature of wireless makes it so difficult to do the kinds of things like measuring a per unit cost based on speed. Your speed of your broadband connection over your wireless device depends on which cell sector you're in, how many people are there, the equipment on your wireless device, which many people think is edge equipment, but in our networks, the devices that you carry around in your pocket are very much network equipment in how closely they're coordinated with the base stations they connect to. Depends on which base station you're connected to. It depends on what season it is, quite honestly, because leaves and foliage affect your speed. So trying to figure out that sort of information is very difficult in this space. And I think we've seen, and certainly wireless has borne this out, Americans like unlimited plans. Americans like unlimited plans in voice, they like it in data, and certainly that seems to be the way it has been going. It's not to rule out sort of the pricing models and other things, but it's certainly been the way that we've seen the trend going in this area.
I would push back very, very quickly and just say wireless companies are very good at measuring cost, and that cost usually comes at 20 cents a text message or $1.09 a kilobyte when you go over your service. And the reason that folks sign up for unlimited plans is because they don't want to have to pay those exorbitant rates for use of text message or data.
Isn't that, well, not talking about text messaging, but if we're talking about the broadband data, isn't that in itself a pricing tool? An economic disincentive to go over the amount you've already paid for?
Sure.
It in and of itself is a network management practice.
So back to the test. If it's temporal and if it's narrowly tailored to address a very specific network management congestion problem, then again we have no problem with it. And I think that's a rule that can be applied both to wireless and wireline.
And again, coming back to dynamism, so temporal where? I assure you the base station we're connected to during work hours here is far busier than the base station near my house in Falls Church right now. So.
Okay, Ross?
Yeah, I just say, a lot of our members have been experimenting with consumption-based billing. I know Time Warner had an experiment that it was a PR disaster, and really kind of, I think the concern there was more on the prices they were charging, seeming them too high, and actually on the model itself. We've had companies that have been experimenting with those models for 4 or 5 years with some success in terms of interest. I think this is an evolving marketplace, and certainly there are those, and with HOGs and consumption-based billing can be an effective way to help manage your network. And I think this early on to foreclose the ability to experiment with those kind of models and see if it works. And I think even with regard to adoption, if you can offer a less expensive service to somebody that's just checking email, and a consumption-based model allows you to do that, why would you want to foreclose that happening?
Also, if you look at the OECD numbers, there are probably more countries that are doing that than there are fewer countries. So a growing number of countries are actually using some kind of consumption-based pricing. And yes, ma'am, here and then here. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Valerie Weimer from JSI, and I have a question concerning, which a couple of you have hinted at, what are the programmers' roles on trying to lower the network costs associated with delivering programming? You mentioned ESPN 360 charging for the content, but nothing about, okay, should that content be cached closer to the customer, so perhaps reducing the middle mile charges for actually doing the transport of streaming video. You also mentioned video, is the future of where things are going, and that's going to put even more pressure on higher mile costs and then higher costs to the end user just for transporting, that amount of data. So just would like to hear what people have to say about the, content provider trying to provide the same service, but being able to cache closer to the customer and reduce costs.
Sorry, you mentioned one thing, one of the early learnings you've already figured out in terms of our 1 gig test bed is that you can't do it just by simply sending fiber all the way to the home and you're done. You have to have a content delivery network overlay of some sort. You have to be able to have popular or rich content that's put someplace cached temporarily until it's needed, someplace nearby the home. So that was an interesting thing to us. I mean, we do use CDNs where we have our own network, Akamai and Amazon and eBay. Lots of other folks have their own networks as well. The broadband providers have their own networks in addition to that. So, but they've quickly become kind of a necessity because there really is a way of trying to offload traffic from the middle mile and last mile networks as much as possible. So, we think that's at this point at least, a very competitive market, and I think there'll be more need for that kind of thing and more innovative ways of figuring out how to cache content closer to end users in the future.
I think, Mr.
Hi, to go to something a little bit lower tech. The concept of the consumption model, that before broadband, the big word was information superhighway. Now, if you look at the superhighway, everyone gets to travel on it, but trucks pay fees. Trucks pay more to move the freight because they're taking up more wear and tear on the road, etc. I don't understand why that concept can't go into this future broadband. Why doesn't a user that like a trucker, and that could be an independent trucker or a large trucking company that takes up a lot of space and wear and tear, why can't the internet user pay like that, have to pay more?
Joel?
So, I think the answer is they do already. I think that if you look at Verizon's Fido service, the 20 megs versus 10 megs versus 5 semester, there's different pricing plans for different capacity at your home that consumers pay, and those become pricier. And I'm sure if you talk to Rick or other internet companies that do mostly, that are at the edge and aren't providers themselves, they pay lots of money with regard to transport. So I think the answer is that they already are. If those pricing models are accurate, and if there's data to support where those pricing models should be and whether they're a true reflection of cost, that's a conversation we can get into with regards to what data the FCC should be collecting and how we should measure that based on the cost of service. But I think that you do see a market right now that does implement different types of pricing like that.
Let me just say a word about, I think Joel is being smart here about what consumers need to make decisions. You should get what you pay for. And so we've been working pretty hard on a transparency kind of approach where and frankly, we believe we deliver what we're selling. And I think that if consumers had trust in the fact that when I buy 10 megabits, I'm getting that. When I buy 2020, I'm getting that. Why do I want 2020? Usually because it's a higher bandwidth requirement that I need, right? It's a virtual office where I'm putting files back and forth. And so it's needed by that consumer for a very specific reason. They buy things because that's the value added to them. So being transparent about these speeds, reliability, the kinds of things that customers want to know, I think is something that I think we're behind and we agree with. Now, who sets that? The market or the FCC? And this is where we may part company. In a very vibrant market like we have, a very competitive, where we're not only fighting with each other on the ground, but we're now really in a broadband battle with the wireless folks. Any part of this ecosystem is competing with the other. And what consumers really need is transparency across the board. So if there's an application that's going to take up a lot of my broadband on my phone where I'm paying by the amount I'm using. I ought to know that before I start doing this, right? I ought to know that before I download that thing, that this is going to take up this much capacity. The whole ecosystem, in my view, has got to be more transparent. In a very complex marketplace, we always have to give more information to the customer. I don't believe, having spent my time in regulation, that regulation, government, can ever keep up with this market that's changing so fast. We've got to, as the industry, really put the information out there, and customers who are darn smart about these things and how they're spending their money, and the users of this internet space who are pretty vigilant, quickly understand what's going on, inform the rest in a very viral information kind of economy. And I think that transparency thing is going to be the key to this.
I think it's interesting on the flip side of that also. Yes, heavy users, may find themselves with a higher bill, but we also don't want to foreclose the opposite end of that argument, which is that lower volume users can get a lesser rate. And it's interesting to see in the wireless space, most people don't think about it if they own them, but the Amazon Kindle and the Barnes & Noble Nook are great examples of that. Those are wireless internet devices. They don't go everywhere. The wireless bill was paid through a two-sided market deal on the back end to make sure that you have access to the Barnes & Noble bookstore if you are a Nook owner, or to Amazon's service if you're a Kindle owner. And interestingly enough, that's, if we're getting full circle now to dragging other arguments, under a reasonable network management system, would that be reasonable? That's an internet device that can't go to the entire internet. It can only go one place. So we want to make sure we don't also foreclose those sorts of lower volume or lower cost models as well.
I can't resist adding one thing to your analogy, though, which is what we do in the U.S. is basically we let trucks drive at the top rated speed of a road, which is 60 miles an hour or so, but we'd say we'll charge them more, so they pay more in terms of gasoline, diesel taxes, and other types of, there's a truck tax, tire tax, et cetera, et cetera. The analogy in the broadband world is essentially saying we don't want a lot of truck traffic, so we're going to sell trucks that can only drive 30 miles an hour. And that's really what we're doing in broadband, because I would much rather prefer a price system and get the 150 megs or the 1,000 megs that I can get on my system. The reason Verizon charges more for my 2020 service is because they think 2020 people use more. Not because they're putting a special pipe in my house. I can switch down to 10 or up to 50. It's exactly the same thing. They're using that as essentially as a rationing tool, which I understand why they do it. I'd rather have rationing by price because I don't use a lot of bits, but I want my bits to be incredibly fast. And the only way I can get that is to buy the higher service, which sort of implies that I'm a big user and downloader of movies and things like that, which I'm not. So to me, pricing would be a really pro-consumer thing. And I agree with Joel, it's got to be, you got to set the marginal price right, and I think the marketplace can do that. Same thing in wireless where you get the marginal price set. So I was going to actually have one more time, but we sort of went on a little too long, so I think we need to end here. So I think this was a great panel because I think we only spent about 12% of the time on net neutrality. So please join me in thanking a great panel.